hosts encamp around me, firm to the fight I stand. What terror can confound me with God at my right hand? Isn't that a lovely expression of how David faced all the difficulties in his life? I can't take credit, though. John chose the hymn, so well done, John. Thanks. When last we left David in our second study, we saw him parting from Jonathan. For all they knew for the last time that they would see each other, the arrows had been shot, the coded signal had been given, and David came out of hiding, met Jonathan, even though Jonathan didn't need to do it, and implicated himself in David's escape, and then David has fled. Now, the next place David goes, we read about in the chapter that Josh read to us in 1 Samuel 21, was Nob. Now, Nob was the city of the priests where the tabernacle was. And he sees the high priest. And he doesn't quite tell him the whole truth about what he's doing, or he puts it in a particular way. And he's nowhere chastised for doing that. But he's given hallowed bread. The bread that was coming off the table of showbread to be replaced by fresh is given to David. So isn't that interesting that God is even feeding David from his very table? God is providing for David's needs. And David did something else that we don't learn about until we come to chapter 22 and verse 10, where we're told later that David had inquired of the Lord, or the high priest Ahimelech had inquired of the Lord for him and gave him victuals and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So we need to add that in, that David had asked the priest to inquire of the Lord for him. He was seeking God's help and God's strength. And then he asks for a weapon. And the priest says in verse 9 of chapter 21, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom thou slewest in the valley of Elah, behold, it is here wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If thou wilt take that, take it, for there is no other save that here." And then David takes it. It says at the end of the verse, doesn't it? David said, "There is none like it, give it me." David knew the sword. He had drawn it from Goliath himself, hadn't he? And taken his head, and then taken that sword, now to be his own sword. And it's another reason why I think David was very strong and very big, as opposed to the tiny picture we sometimes get given of what he might have been like. I think that represents a change in David. Do you think that? You know, he hadn't needed a sword when he went to fight Goliath, but now he says, "I'll take the sword." He's in quite a fearful state of mind. The scripture emphasizes that he was quite afraid now of what Saul was doing to him and about him. But he was seen by someone else. Did you notice in verse 7? It said, "Now a certain man of the servants of Saul was there that day, detained before the Lord, and his name was Doeg, an Edomite, the chiefest of the herdmen that belonged to Saul. And Doeg saw David, and David saw Doeg. They didn't speak, no doubt, but it was noted by Doeg that David was there and all that David did." Now that will have massive implications when we come to see what happened later to this poor town. Because as a result of Doeg seeing David there and telling Saul, Saul sends his army to the town and they slaughter the town. And we're going to see tomorrow a very moving scene where the sole survivor of that slaughter comes to David for help. And David said, "I knew it that day when I saw Doeg that he would tell Saul." And so very sadly, it ends ill for the priests at Nob because they help David. But you know, when David leaves Nob, he does the strangest thing, and you couldn't have guessed what he would do, because where do you think was the last place David should go? Bearing in mind that David had slain Goliath, and now he had Goliath's sword. And there was a song widely current saying, "Saul has slain his thousands, David his 10,000s." Where was the last place he should go to? Now, if I ask you, where was Goliath's hometown? So where was Goliath born or from? Gath, yeah. So wouldn't you think Gath would be the last place you'd want to go with Goliath's sword? But what does it say in verse 10? "David arose and fled that day for fear of Saul, and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said unto him, Is not this David, the king of the land. Now, that's not quite what he is it? Isn't it interesting that the Philistines think David is the king? And this contributes to why it was that Saul was so jealous. As far as the Philistines were concerned, David was the king because he was the one who was at the head of the armies riding out. And they say, this is the king. They also say, in verse 11, did they not sing one to another of him in dances, saying, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s? So it must have been an incredibly catchy song because everyone in Gath knew it. Verse 12, and David laid up these words in his heart and was sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. And then it says he pretends to be mad, verse 13. He changed his behavior before them and feigned himself mad in their hands and scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Do you know something? I don't know how much pretending David needed to do. He says he pretended to be mad. He wanders into the Philistine country, to the hometown of Goliath, whom he has slain, holding Goliath's sword, knowing that they all know about his slaying of Goliath and the great victory of Israel, and he's there in the middle. I think he perhaps had gone a bit mad to go there. Why would you do it? And so he pretends to be mad, but I don't know how much play acting was needed. Verse 14, then said Achish unto his servants, Lo, ye see, the man is mad. Wherefore then have ye brought him to me? Now we're not told exactly what happened to get David out of there, but we are told in the Psalms. If you just come to Psalm 34, and you see what we're doing here in our studies, we often have to go into the Psalms to supplement the material we're given in Samuel. It tells us more, and it tells us, very importantly, what was happening in David's mind and in his heart, what his thoughts were about these things. And this psalm, Psalm 34, was written at that very occasion, doubtless in his head and then put to paper later, as it were. The title of Psalm 34 says, a psalm of David when he changed his behavior before Abimelech, who drove him away and he departed. So that's what we didn't know from Samuel, that the king drove him away and said, I've got enough mad men, thanks, I've fulfilled my quota, I don't need another, so off you go. And they pushed David away. And David had great cause to reflect on what had happened that day. If you look at verse 6, this poor man cried, and the Lord heard him and saved him out of all his troubles. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. And David knew the reality of those words from that day in Gath. There he was at the very eye of the storm, in Gath. And God delivered him and saved him. Do you notice that then? He didn't just pretend to be mad, he prayed. This was his prayer to God, that God would save him. And then he acted in faith, and as it was, he pretended to be mad. And it worked under the goodness of God's hand upon him. Verse 18, the Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivereth him out of them all. He keepeth all his bones, not one of them is broken. Evil shall slay the wicked, and they that hate the righteous shall be desolate. The Lord redeemeth the soul of his servants, and none of them that trust in him shall be desolate. And David knew that from that day, and he would teach the men that would come around him. And we want to see that happen now. So let's go back to 1 Samuel and catch up with where we are on our timeline. So there was that song again that almost killed David for a second time. Saul has slain his thousands and David his 10,000s. So we've been following his childhood when he was a shepherd. He became a musician at Saul's court. Then he killed Goliath. Everything changed. He became a soldier and didn't go back anymore to the fields. He became a captain. He married Michal, and then he had to flee his house. And we want to expand this section now, which I think we can do, to have a look at his life as an outlaw. If you're in 1 Samuel 22, I know I've given away where I'm going next up there, but just look at 1 Samuel 22, verse 1. Finally, David finds a resting place for a time, and he comes to a cave, Adullam, where he will begin to rebuild. It says in verse 1, David therefore departed thence and escaped to the cave Adullam. So he's in this cave, no security, no food, no one to talk to, in a lonely, dark and damp place. And what did he do? He wrote a psalm. And we won't turn there because I've got, in fact, the whole psalm on the screen. Psalm 142, a psalm written in a cave. This is what David said. Imagine him there, no one to help. I cried unto the Lord with my voice unto the Lord did I make supplication. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. I looked on my right hand, and behold, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. I cried unto thee, O Lord. I said, thou art my refuge and my portion in the land of the living. Attend unto my cry, for I am brought very low. Bring my soul out of prison, that I may praise thy name. The righteous shall encompass me about, for thou shalt deal bountifully with me. Notice his prayer, the righteous shall compass me about. And that is what begins to happen. If you look at the second half of verse 1 of chapter 22, it says, he got to the cave, and when his brethren and all his father's house heard it, they went down thither to him. So his family arrive at the cave. So all his brothers come. You remember Eliab and Abinadab and the others, Ozem, Radai. They all got great names, David's brothers, if you look them up. And probably his two sisters, Zeruiah and Abigail. They came down with Jesse and his mother, and they're with him. And wouldn't that have been a marvelous source of comfort and encouragement to him? But you know, he wasn't the only one in distress. If you look at verse 2, it says, everyone that was in distress, everyone that was in debt, and everyone that was discontented, or the margin says, bitter of soul, gathered themselves unto him, and he became a captain over them. And there were with him about 400 men. So he thinks he's on his own, but actually there's 400 others who are in the same situation, and they come to him in that cave, and he becomes their captain. So when God brings us to nothing, it's not to end our lives, it's to rebuild and reroute, and that's exactly what God starts doing now with David. So what does he do? We'll rejoin the timeline, the expanded one. He becomes a captain. So we're going to look a little bit more in detail now at this outlaw period. Becomes a captain of outlaws, a Robin Hood, as it were. And I'm sure this is the basis for the Robin Hood story. He takes his parents to Moab. He obviously decides, this isn't the safest place for my parents, and so he takes them to Moab. Now, who was the Moabite who was a relative of David's in his ancestry? Ruth. That's right, Caleb. It was Ruth. Ruth was his great-grandmother. Rahab was his great-great-grandmother, and Ruth was his great-grandmother. He had a marvelous set of great-grandmothers, didn't he? And Ruth was a Moabitess. So they were allies, and he takes his family to Moab for them to be safe. And then you notice in verse 5, the prophet Gad comes to him. The prophet Gad said to David, abide not in the hole, depart and get thee into the land of Judah. You've got to be in the land of your people. Then David departed and came to the forest, Hareth. So that's why we changed to the forest from the cave, because that's where David and his men now are. And then something quite wonderful happens. If you look at chapter 23, and I know we're just skipping over one or two events because we won't go through them all, but chapter 23, someone very famous comes to the forest, verse 16. And Jonathan, Saul's son, arose and went to David into the wood and strengthened his hand in God. Of course he did. Jonathan was not going to allow any risk to himself to prevent him from going to see David. Remember, they were knit together. Nothing could stop him. And he goes and strengthens David's hand in God. Verse 17, and he said unto him, fear not, For the hand of Saul my father shall not find thee, and thou shalt be king over Israel, and I shall be next unto thee. And that also Saul my father knows." I think this is the first time Jonathan has explicitly said this. It's always been known, but it's been unsaid. But now he says it. He says, "You will be king, and I will be with you. We'll be next to each other in the kingdom." And you know, they wouldn't be next to each other in this kingdom or in that kingdom then, because the next time David speaks of Jonathan, it's to lament his death. But they would be together in the kingdom, wouldn't they? Because when the Lord Jesus Christ returns to the earth and forms them out of the dust, they will be together once more, forever, in the kingdom. And that was what we noticed. We won't go back, but in chapter 20, in their covenant in the Lord, their friendship, it was talking about forever. It had the word forever in it. And you think, well, is that just, using hyperbole, forever? I love you forever. It wasn't. It was actually factual, because in the kingdom, forever, they will be friends and together. That's what friendship in the Lord can be. Forever. Well, Saul doesn't give up chasing David, and whatever David does, he just can't convince Saul to stop chasing him. And I don't know if you have someone in your life who just sets themselves against you and decides that they're going to be your enemy for whatever reason. Perhaps you don't, and probably you don't, and hopefully you don't. But if you do, sometimes there's nothing you can do to change their outlook to you. And David just can't seem to get it through to Saul. His envy and his jealousy is so strong. I'm just going to jump over a couple of things, because we're going to talk about Abiathar tomorrow. Jonathan visits, and I think that would have been a great strength to David's men to meet Jonathan, because Jonathan was very famous. He was the prince, he was the heir to the throne. And David, I'm sure, would have spent many an hour telling them about Jonathan and about his friendship with him and about Jonathan's character and about how they should be with each other, because they're going to be friends together. And then Saul pursues David, the Philistines invade, and David finds himself at En-gedi. So just come to chapter 24, and we have to just home in now on one incident that we can learn some lessons from David. And it's a remarkable incident. You couldn't have made it up, what happens in chapter 24. It says in verse 1 of 1 Samuel 24, "It came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines." If it looks like I can't read, then there's a shadow just falling over my Bible. You can't see it, I can see it, and it's just covering it, but I can read. Verse 1, "It came to pass when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats." Now, I don't know how many people Saul had heard that David had with him, but Saul takes 3,000 soldiers with him. Now, that's an interesting number for a couple of reasons. First of all, back in chapter 13, when Saul was leading the army against the Philistines, 3,000 was the number in chapter 13, verse 2, that he took with him to fight the Philistine army. So that means that in Saul's mind, David and his men are analogous to the entire Philistine army. That's how dangerous he thought they were. David has slain his 10,000s, so he takes 3,000. There was another man in the past, and I'll see if you know this, who was fighting the Philistines and had to flee and hide in a cave. And his brethren sent 3,000 men to get him out of the cave. Do you know who that was? And they said, "We'll tie you up and give you to the Philistines." Who was that? Just before this period. Samson, as if I could mimic being Samson. That's it. You're absolutely right, Jacob. It was Samson. In Judges 15, 3,000 men was the number Judah sends to get Samson from the cave in the rock of Etam for fighting the Philistines. And it's just another reference to the fact that many things in Samson's life, killing the lion and so on, reflect David's. They were doing the same thing, delivering Israel from the Philistine foe. I think David would have taken comfort from that. So 3,000 men come to find David and his 400 men. Now it says in verse 3, "He came to the sheepcotes by the way where was a cave, And Saul went in to cover his feet. And David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. Now, I don't know if you can imagine that scene. And so there's a picture there that might give some idea of it, that Saul, in his mad rush for vengeance, has to answer the call of nature and go into a cave. But he doesn't go into just any cave, he romps right into the cave that David and all his men are hiding in the recesses. Now, can you imagine that? Talk about being vulnerable. Saul was incredibly vulnerable in this cave. And if you want to test the carnality of a person, what they're like, ask them what they should do when their enemy is vulnerable. And unless they're a man or woman of God, they'll tell you to strike every time. And in fact, David's men tell David to do just that. They say, in fact, that God has delivered him into your hand. Look at verse 4. The men of David said unto him, Behold the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. So his men say, this is the day God spoke about, and here Saul is, so you can kill him, and then the kingdom will be yours. And then David, it says at the end of verse 4, David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. Now that's quite something, isn't it? And I think it gives us an insight into the skill David had as a warrior. You know, only a ninja could come out from the recesses of the cave, crawl along, cut Saul's border of his garment off, and Saul not know. It's incredible that David was able to do that, but he does it. But then something happens. He becomes troubled. It says in verse 5, It came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. So his conscience bothered him. Why? He could have killed Saul, but he didn't. All he did was cut off a little bit of his robe. Who cares about that? Saul didn't even notice that it was gone. But even a small step in the wrong direction is a wrong step, isn't it? Even a small step on the road to retaliation and revenge is a wrong step. And so David's conscience bothers him, and he felt guilt. And that's a good thing that he felt guilt. It's when you stop feeling guilt, when you do something wrong, that you're in real trouble. You know, it's when our conscience bothers us and we don't let ourselves get away with it. When we want to come to terms with the little details. When we get home from school or work and there's a paperclip in our bag that was from school, we have to take it back the next day because it's not ours. And we can't just say it doesn't matter. You know, and you think, well, that's a bit crazy. But no, that's wanting to get right with God. That's wanting the details to be right and true. And David says, I can't do this. I can't start on this road. And he doesn't let himself get away with it. The words of his men are interesting. They resemble the temptations of the Lord Jesus Christ. Because in the temptations of Christ, when Jesus was led up of the Spirit into the wilderness, the devil takes him up into an exceeding high mountain and shows him all the kingdoms of the world and the glory of them, and says, all these things will I give you if you will fall down and worship me. It was the same temptation, really. It was, here's a shortcut to the kingdom, take it. And the men were saying the same thing. And he had to resist. Was there something else to the skirt? Now, just come and have a look at Numbers chapter 15 of what David had cut off. You might think it was just a random bit of Saul's robe, but it was actually quite a specific bit. If you look at Numbers chapter 15 and verse 38, there was, if Saul was dressed as he should have been, and I think that's a big assumption, perhaps he wasn't, but if he was dressed as he should have been, then David would have been holding something specific in his hand. What would he have been holding? Numbers 15, verse 38. The Lord had spoken to Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, and bid them that they make them fringes in the borders of their garments, throughout their generations, that they put upon the fringe of the borders a riband of blue. Now the word borders is the same word as the word skirts in 1 Samuel 24. So what David cut off was the borders of Saul's robe. And in that border, the law said there should be a riband of blue. And that's the modern day Jewish equivalent. Something like that would have been on the fringes of Saul's garments if he was dressing as he should. Now, what was the significance of it? It says in verse 39, "It shall be unto you for a fringe, that ye may look upon it, and remember all the commandments of the Lord, and do them, and that ye seek not after your own heart and your own eyes, after which ye used to go a-whoring, that ye may remember and do all my commandments, and be holy unto your God. I am the Lord your God, which brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. I am the Lord your God." So when David looked at the riband of blue in his hands, he was reminded of the commandments of God, and he said, hey, I'm holy to the Lord. I can't be taking revenge into my own hands. And he remembered. But also, and I think more importantly, he was taking away from Saul one of the only things that was actually speaking to Saul and telling Saul that he must obey the commandments of God. And how could he do that? How could he take that away from Saul? And so his heart smote him. And if you come back to 1 Samuel and have a little look at what happens next, something even more exciting in terms of what David is doing with these men, because he's teaching them the ways of God. If you come back to chapter 24 and have a look there at what happens next when David realizes he can't do this thing. Now, I wasn't going to quote it at the time, but in Psalm 34, and we won't go back there, but David had said in that psalm, which he wrote when he departed from Achish, "Come, ye children, hearken unto me, I will teach you the fear of the Lord." That's Psalm 34, verse 11. So the men who came to David became his pupils, his students in how to behave. And we're going to see now a master class from David to his men in chapter 24. Look at what happens. It says in verse 6, "He said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way." Now, isn't that remarkable? Here we see, and we don't see it often, we see someone doing the right thing and taking everyone with them. You know, how often do we see someone doing the wrong thing and others are influenced by it? They see someone doing what they shouldn't be doing, and then they do the same, and he takes them away. But here, David says this is how we should be, and he takes them with him, and they obey that example. It says that he stayed them there. He stayed them, verse 7, with his words. And if you look at the margin, it says that stayed means cut off. And it's literally tore apart, pierced through, ripped up. He ripped them up. And I don't imagine for a moment that David's men just mildly said to David, "Oh, look, David, here's the day that the Lord spoke of your enemy into your hands. Why don't you take your opportunity?" And David said, "Oh, no, chaps, I don't think so. I'll leave him be." It wasn't like that at all, was it? It says David ripped them up. He was strong. He was zealous. He was an example. And they followed him. There's few things more infectious than a godly lifestyle, and the people around us need that kind of challenge, don't they? They need to see someone that's just genuinely, honestly, sincerely faithful and good in their example, and we can take others with us. Well, the Apostle Paul leaves us with the lesson that we must take from this incident in David's life. He says, "Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves." If you're thinking about snapping back or retaliating, don't. Because even a small step on that road is a wrong step. For it is written, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." If there's vengeance to be taken, then it's God's to do. And that's the spirit that he wants his children to have, to leave it all in God's hands. And what does the apostle say? "Be not overcome of evil, And David was really tempted to be overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And may that be the mantra of our lives, as it was of David's. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good.